My name is Rob van Hattem and I'm a science reporter for Dutch Public Television and Chief Science Officer for NEMO Science Museum in Amsterdam. And you're about to hear and to see an interview with Gabriela Ramos, and she is a member of the External Advisory Board of the Institute for Advanced Study of the University of Amsterdam. But that's of course not her daily job. Good day, Ms. Ramos. Hello.
Good morning. How are you, Rob?
Yes, I'm fine. Maybe you can introduce yourself and tell a little bit more about your daily work.
Well, I am the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science at UNESCO. And this is just a continuation of a long career at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as Chief of Staff and Sherpa. Sherpa to the G20 means that I represented the leader in the meetings of the G20 leaders. But the whole point is that I have been working to advance a more inclusive and sustainable path of growth. And now in UNESCO, the social and human sciences sector is really trying to make these sciences count to find solutions to the challenges we face.
So now you're Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO. And it's stated about your assignment, it says, and I'm reading, to oversee the contributions of the UNESCO to build inclusive and peaceful societies. Well, that seems a very difficult task if you look at the current crisis like COVID and climate crisis, increasing polarization, inequality worldwide, to mention just a few issues.
Certainly. But I would have to say that the mandate is more relevant than ever. For many years, we had a supremacy of institutions that were dealing only with the economics of financial issues. They called the shots in many ways in terms of policy making and decisions that were taken, the trade liberalization, the globalization, the financial deregulation, all of these major decisions were taken particularly by financial ministers. But I feel that the complexity of the times we are living, that shows how all these systems are interconnected, requires that all science come together. Not only the economics, but also the sociology, the psychology, philosophy, welcome back philosophy, anthropology, and all the natural sciences, and to really make them count. And you know what is very interesting? That even in this context in which we know that to fight the pandemic, we need to be scientific-based, evidence-based. What is happening is that the very divided societies that we have are producing political outcomes that neglect science. So our task is more relevant. COVID is a wake-up call, but I think it's the most dramatic wake-up call, and we wish we didn't have it. But it was a wake-up call because we were not building resilient systems. I don't think that even the most advanced economies had resilient health systems. We were always looking at efficiency. That was the ultimate goal for economic policy. And we were defining always, I would not go against any kind of fiscal rectitude, but it cannot be only about fiscal rectitude. It cannot only be about GDP and GDP per capita. I think that what COVID is reminding us, and it's almost like a mirror where you see yourself and you find all the vulnerabilities that were there and that are coming now back to haunt us. The inequalities, the lack of protection, the gaps, the gender inequalities, for example, the fact that you have half of the world population not connected to internet while others are ready to telework, the fact that you are having now countries that have bought 5 times the vaccines, and you have 20 vaccines in the global south just delivered. So I feel that this crisis is really putting into question the social, economic, and environmental models that we have followed. And one of the key challenges is not only to understand better each one of these systems, but how they interact together. Because this is a health, social, economic crisis. And you will only find the solution if we bring all those aspects together. And it's, as I said, a wake-up call that we don't have any other choice than to change the stance.
But it's so difficult, I think, to policy making at this moment, it's particularly difficult because it's not only complicated, it's actually very complex. Do you agree on that?
You're completely right, because it's not about being complicated, because it is. Complicated means that you can barely understand how things work, but at the end, it's just a matter of explaining how it is, and even if it's complicated, at the end you understand. It's like a car, you know how a car works, and even if it is complicated, at the end you end up by mastering it. When it gets complex is when you cannot control the whole environment. It's like traffic. Then you don't know. The level of uncertainty is very high. The level of unpredictability is very high. All the components that are really interacting with each other in many different ways bring very different outcomes. So complexity, what means is that first you need to try to map out all those dynamics and all those interactions and the feedback loops that we never consider in a linear understanding of the world. And then to recognize that life is uncertain. And that's not a comfortable truth for many. Even for me, I don't like uncertainty. I don't think people like uncertainty, but that's the main characteristic of complex systems.
It's somehow tempting to, let's say, reduce the big problems to smaller, manageable elements, and then relay them to experts in a specific discipline. That's rather common in science, but that's something you can't afford with these complex issues, I think.
I would say that we cannot be so either or. Because at the end, you will always need to rely on certain disciplines, on certain dissecting of the problems in a way that you can manage them and understand them. The only point is that you cannot turn that into the overall explanation of everything, and that's what happened with the economic theory that we have been relying on for the last decades. We did not only dissect the world into an economic sphere that was completely disconnected from the environmental or the social interaction. It was just the economic modeling based on assumptions that didn't hold, because it produced linear, almost consequential actions that will lead to higher prosperity. And then we produced metrics that didn't capture the reality. We just relied on GDP and GDP growth without looking at equity or at sustainability. So the problem is not whether you can dissect and simplify the problems, because that's a scientific way of doing things. But the fact is that this is just to keep understanding one specific problem. But then you need to look at other issues, broaden the scope. Don't think that because you have understood the dynamics of certain specific aspect of a challenge, you have understood everything. Because what happens is that what we ignore when we go with that kind of thinking is that there are interrelationships, that there are feedback loops, that there are unintended consequences. Let me just give you one example, which is fantastic. In Mexico, my country, one of the most successful poverty alleviation programs encouraged all the peasants to increase their productivity. And they did so. And you know what happened? It was the most catastrophic environmental impact, because all the peasants, what they did was to cut trees and increase the harvest. So we need to look at the unintended consequences. And this is something that we are not good at. We need to understand that not everything is linear. And we need to understand that depending on our actions, we might also influence the systems in ways that we don't know and that we also need to understand. But the reality is that we need to be very humble. We need to be humble and say, well, according to what I understand, this is how it works. Although we need to look at all the other issues that might create other problems that we need to be aware.
And there are some, pandemics, climate change, cyber terrorism, economic crisis, mass migration. There are so many of these problems and they're so intertwined. How would you address that?
Well, I will address them, as I said, with the more accurate analytical method. which is not based on these linearities, which is not based on the assumption that we humans are consumers or producers or are rational agents that will not assume that markets stabilize themselves as a matter of natural science. I would actually move away from those assumptions and try to bring from other natural sciences like biology more accurate ways of depicting the world in a more evolutionary and adaptive way, considering issues like resilience, considering issues like non-linearity, considering issues of non-ergodicity. You cannot just transplant issues from the previous past to understand the future. And really borrow from this other science to understand better the interactions that we are confronted now. I don't think we can produce outcomes in the economic field, if we try to just get into this subject, without understanding how the natural base is being depleted. And therefore, we will need to change the tools we use to understand this. I don't think we can continue just growing the way we grow, and this is very worrisome, Rob, because of the shape of the crisis and the fact that we just closed down whole sectors of the economy by the confinement. Probably the recovery is going to be fast. We will have good numbers, and then people will relax and will say, okay, now we're growing at 3%, 5%, we're recovering. The fact is that we cannot go back to that kind of growth because the reality is that the distributional issues were never considered, and inequality has grown massively, with 130 more million people going back to poverty, and the digital platforms that, of course, they have allowed us to be here talking to you, earning 3 times their income. And we cannot ignore that this is also a zootechnic pandemic. It came back about our interactions with the environment, so we need to change them. We need to bring the environmental, social, economic systems in a whole understanding of how better to advance the challenges. It's more complex, but there is no other choice.
In fact, you say in order to face the future challenges, actually also the current challenges, you need sort of new, let's say, research instrument, a navigation instrument or something for a complex world. But how would such an instrument look like?
Well, first and foremost, I would, as I said, I would use complex systems thinking, because that will bring you to another kind of understanding of how systems interact themselves, how your own interventions as policymaker, as economic agent, brings changes in the system that will lead to different outcomes. That's a very important point, because we always think about the economy as an exogenous issue, and therefore whatever you do is not changing the shape of the whole system, but it is, and it's the same for the environment. But I would say that besides moving away from these more simplistic theoretical underpinnings of the past that we have used, that just ignore or define the policy challenges in a silo approach and forget about what would that bring in other areas of human interaction, I would actually develop a multidimensional approach. I will try to bring different objectives, competing objectives. We have been focusing on efficiency, as I said. We have maximized our outcomes. We have maximized our income. We have maximized production, and that's a synonym of success. Its GDP is GDP per capita. What about all the other multidimensional aspects that matter for people? What about these social interactions that now know that are so important? What about trust? You know, one of the issues that I always found very difficult in the OECD, and I'm trying to see if I can do it from UNESCO, I think I will have more chances, is how do we measure fairness and fair outcomes? It's very difficult to capture those things. How do we foster trust? Again, but if we know that the level of inequalities have raised this high status as they have now, or that the climate challenge is just unavoidable, the climate crisis, we cannot just continue using the same old lenses. And so multidimensionality, multidisciplinarity, bringing the point of views of different sciences, and then the complex system approach. But there had been a lot of progress, and I think that the university also, that's why I'm so proud to be part of their committee, because the fact is that we are making progress. Computational models are trying to capture much better these different modeling work and trying to get a better grasp of how human reacts, how migration works, how does it impact the environment, how do we go for real relationship between economics and politics and sociology, and so why would we spare the lessons that all these sciences can put at the table for us to understand better? Because we need to understand better, and we need better decision making.
You said at the International Peace Forum in Nanjing, and now I read it, we need a new growth model that considers equity and environment at the same level than efficiency in markets. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by this new growth model?
Well, I have mentioned, Rob, the fact is that we have been, as we used to say in the OECD, we have been treasuring what we measure instead of measure what we treasure. And what we treasure is not the indicators that the stock exchange give or not, is not the GDP or GDP per capita, as important as it is. I'm not saying that we need to relinquish the GDP, and the GDP per capita is one of the elements. But this element only measures material well-being. And it only measures how markets behave. And it only measures if we are productive or not. And that's important. But we humans are not only consumers or producers or workers. We're not. This is part of the basis of the well-being that we need to have, because if you don't have your basic income really secured, how could you move from that? But it's not only that. I feel that we really need to make sure that we start this clash with nature. And then we need to move away from this mantra that neoclassical economists have also put up front, to say you need to grow first to redistribute later. And I'm saying it again, because as we soon as start growing after this terrible pandemic moves away, people will feel comfortable with numbers like the GDP and GDP per capita, but these numbers don't tell you anything about equity. And my point is not to say, okay, you grow first, redistribute later through the tax system, and that's all you need, no? And you pay for those that fall behind. Well, that's not the point, because what is happening is that we are hurting even growth with the level of inequalities. We are not investing in the human capital of low-income kids. They're not receiving the same quality education. We are not giving the same level of protection. And my goal is, by putting equity and sustainability up front with efficiency, which is important, you will bring these other elements together, and maybe you will respond to them in a more efficient way, because you will say, okay, you know what? It's not about redistributing after. You just mess the whole thing and then you try to fix it. It's how do we ensure that growth is produced in an inclusive manner? How do we ensure that we don't have so many people left behind? Because it's morally wrong, it's humanly wrong, but it's economically wrong. We're missing so much capacity of these people, the self-fulfillment. And on top, you have very angry people that then are translated into very radical options in the political sphere. So at least let's recognize that we have these three objectives: efficiency, equality, and sustainability should at least inform the debate, which has not been the case. The environment and the social issues were always secondary to the real core economic debate that we are having up to now.
How can we organize this? I mean, if you say we have to organize a sort of institute or an organization that is really focused on this complexity, how can we organize that?
Well, with people like you, like the university, with the UNESCO and the social and human science, but we also have the natural science, with the NAEC, the new approaches in the OECD, with the Santa Fe Institute, with IASA, with all these institutions, prestigious scholars that had been saying, let's try to model better the world we live in, with all the interactions, with all the linkages among systems, with all the uncertainties and the radical uncertainty that characterize these kind of behaviors, and bring stronger voices. I think that it is up to us, Rob, to prove that this helps, makes better decisions. And I think we can do it. And we should not be scared because it's complex. Because if it is complex, it's because the world is complex.
You are in this board of the Institute for Advanced Study. I can imagine that you sort of would say maybe you should just set up a scientific institute for complexity research. I mean, something like that.
Yes, that's what that's what I have been saying, and I was so glad that this is something that is not because I said that they are already considering and doing it. What I said is that the more institutes we have like this, and with the rigor of the institute, I feel that this could make a great contribution. But it's not only about that. I think that we need to join forces with many other people, institutions, scholars that have been pushing for this kind of analytical frameworks, because we need to join forces and we need to make sense. I think that the most important thing is that we need to make sense of the challenges we confront, and to people to valorize. So yes, the Institute can make a great contribution by moving on that direction.
If I may say, I think you are an optimist, if I would ask you whether you are an optimist or a pessimist.
No, I'm not pessimistic or optimistic. I'm activistic. I'm a woman in a rush. So I will just take whatever insight these beautiful sciences can provide us. And I'm more optimistic. The reality is that I'm more optimistic. I have seen the amazing resilience of communities, the generosity of communities, the solidarity of communities. I have seen the youth, the elderly coming out to help. I think we will deliver much better after this wake-up call, as I said at the beginning.
But your motto seems to be, try to understand it, but remain humble.
I'm more concerned of people that have all the answers. I think that we have been also, I grew and you grew in a period where the more competitive people will have all the answers. They will know everything and they will know all the answers. I would say that as going back to philosophy, sometimes it's much better to define the good questions and to be humble, because being humble opens your mind to listen, to hear different views, even views. I mean, you see it in the political debates. It's just right or left. I live in France, and this is fantastic because people shake my hand. Well, now they don't shake my hand because of COVID, but when they used to shake my hand, they would say, oh, I'm Lucien from gauche, I'm from the right, or I'm from the left. I mean, these categories, I mean, I really think we need to open up our minds and to listen to all these different points of views, because the level of challenges that we have require that we are open and that we listen. And I think that this is something that the complex systems also produces, a change in mentality. First, of not having all the answers, of not controlling everything, of getting used to this level of uncertainty, but also being open to whatever contribution people from other disciplines can bring. And I know it's more complex. It might be, I might sound to you very idealistic, but there are very concrete applications to this new narrative that would be, for example, that in the governments, you bring the finance minister with the environmental minister, with the education ministers together to solve issues. No longer these silos that decide, no, the financial minister or the economic minister decide on key issues that concern the whole of society, and we leave to the social affairs minister whatever he needs to do to fix. So it's as I said, there's lots of ways in we can advance institutional innovation in our universities, in our governments, multidisciplinary teams, different models to look at the same phenomena, to see what each model provides. It requires a lot of work, but I think that it's worth investing.
And by the way, there's nothing wrong with idealism, I think.
No, because we need inspiration. More than anything, we need inspiration. We need to be inspired, and we need to, as I said, let's go back to the Renaissance, when inspiration was everything to break the mold and deliver better, no?
Well, thank you very much for this interview.
Thanks to you, and looking forward to this continuous conversation.
All right, thank you.